Where to begin? I got a letter the other day. It was from a niece. The letter had been a very, very, very long time coming. But before you speculate why that might be, let me tell you her story. I shall do it in her words, but I think I shall remain myself today. Oh, Uncle, I never did tell you about what led me here. That job in Bly. I met the father. Oh, he was so handsome. He interviewed me long for the job. I was to be a governess of a beautiful estate gone awry, he said. I must steer it back on course. I was to be the governess of 2 children, his lovely son and daughter, Miles and little Flossie. I was not to bother him, ever, for he wished to have his own life, but to know that whatever happened to them, whatever had happened to them, whatever would happen to them, they were in good hands. Well, as you know, Uncle, I have not had much work. Indeed, this was my very first job. I was anxious about my competence. I have been trained well. I can teach a little drawing, a little Latin, a little of this, a little of that, and I like children. But to run a house, that was a different matter. And when I expressed my inadequacies, he said that there was a housemaid there, Mrs. Gorse, who I must be a companion to also. So the very next day I found myself on the train, going down to Bly, and it was as my patron had described it. An old great house, sadly neglected, more dust sheets than ornament now, with that strange smell you get when a building isn't quite used enough. Only the kitchen, with Mrs. Gorse, and the hall, and the nursery, and little Flossie's bedroom were well used. My own bedroom, which was right next door, was a mess of dust, and photos that had not been thrown out. I did not know what had happened to any predecessor I had had. My patron had alluded to one, but I thought it tactful not to ask. So I settled down, and Flossie was adorable. I can't begin to describe how much her golden hair and her blue, blue eyes warmed my heart to see her. And she gave me a big hug and said she was sure, like with Miss Jessup, we would be great friends. And I shivered to hear the name of my predecessor. The next day, Miles was due. So I took it to ask Mrs. Gorse, how was their house? And she told me, oh, it's a fearful mess. The master hasn't been here, not for years now. And it was run before by his man of business, Mr. Blay and Mr. Jessup. And what happened to them? Were they corrupt? Oh, no. His man of business, Mr. Quint, died, skid on the ice, cracked his head on the lake over there when it was frozen last winter. And Miss Jessup? I'm not sure, but she seemed to waste away soon after, and died. Oh well, what sadness. It is just as well that I am here to steer this ship back to happiness. Well, the next day, Miles was due. But before he could ever arrive, I got a letter. Now, Uncle, even you, man of the world as you are, I do not feel comfortable describing what that child was accused of in his school. The unmentionable sin. And it was with some trepidation I waited for him at the station with his sister, and she was all delight to see him. And when he got off the train, she ran to the most picturesque boy you could imagine. He looked perfect, as if you could put him in your mouth and he would be so sweet. And he came and he greeted me and he shook my hand and said, "Hello, I'm Miles, and you must be my new governess. I am so very delighted to meet you. I hope Flossie has been making you company, but now there's a man about the house." And so he chortled on. He seemed so grown up. It was hard, so hard, to understand what the headmaster said he had done with this fine chap. I decided to forget and to observe myself and to see what I made of it all. For a woman's intuition is worth any headmaster. Well, the next day I said them about the schoolroom, and I thought while they were doing their tasks, I would just go for a walk in the garden. Walk down to the lake. And I did. And as I turned round, I saw on the tower that's next to the house, there was a man. He was looking at me, full in the face. Half anger, half curious. His face was gaunt and sunk. His hair was long, but pulled away from the back of his head. His eyes seemed black and dark, for I could see them, for as I came to the house he stayed there, staring at the tower, on the tower. I didn't say anything to anyone. I just went up the spiral staircase to the tower. I came out, and there was no one. Only the distant crying of children who were bored and having finished their task. Well, I said nothing to nobody. I went down and I got them doing their Latin, and I thought, just forget it. But that evening, I asked Mrs. Gorse, just in idle curiosity, almost, what Mr. Quint had looked like. And she said, "Oh, he was a most handsome man, gaunt, with dark eyes and long hair." And I shivered. It was 2 days later. The children I had dismissed to go and play in the garden. It was a bright sunny day, and I was just finishing marking Miles's homework. He's not very good at maths, you know. We will have to work upon it. When I looked up, and there was the same gaunt man standing in the window of the schoolroom. The strange, questioning, half-angry look on his eye, his dark brow drawn. Well, I thought, I'm going to have a word with him this time. I got up. I went through the window, which was big and opened out directly onto the garden. And as the distant dogs barked, I looked. And there was nobody. Nobody at all. But I thought, I'm going to just stand where he was. And I looked down in the flower bed. And there were no footprints, although the earth was loose. Just at that moment, Mrs. Gorse came in, looked through the window, and jumped as if she had seen a ghost. I called to her and ran into the room. And she said, "Oh, miss, you gave me such a start. For a minute I thought you were Miss Jessup looking in. What to do?" And I said to her, "Were Mr. Quint and Mr. Jessup quite correct with the children? For some strange dark premonition was in my mind. And she looked at me and said, well, I never liked the way they went on with them. It was a relief when they went, although of course it was a sadness. I was never sure they would take the children off for hours on end. And were they together? Oh yes, of course. Mr. Quint and Mrs. Jessup were quite lovers. If the patron had been around, if the master had been around, I'm sure he would have got rid of Mr. Quint. But he weren't, so I could do nothing. And I worried for a moment. But just then, Flora called me from the garden, and I ran out. And there was she and Miles, playing adorably. And I played with them. It was towards the end of the afternoon. I was with Flora down by the lake, when I saw standing on the other side a woman. Her face was pockmarked, as if she had been very ill quite recently. And her eyes stared at us, almost popping out of her head. She wore a hat that was distinctly last year's fashion, but otherwise was well dressed. And before her recent disease, might have once been beautiful. But that beauty was changed and shifted. I looked at her, and then I asked Flora, do you see her? And Flora looked straight at the figure and said, I see no one. And then Mrs. Gorse turned up, and I said, do you see the figure over there? And Mrs. Gorse said, no, there's nobody there, just shadow. Just shadow, I tell thee. And shepherded us all off to tea. Well, we all went to tea. And I thought to myself, now don't make a fuss. Don't worry the children. These are just echoes in time. That those that loved them come to see their children once again is not terribly surprising. That they check that I am fit to look after their children is barely surprising. I will be worthy of this charge, and that is all that matters in the end. All that matters. And so I created a rigid discipline. I made the children work. I played with them. We had so much fun together. Those weeks at Bly passed and passed. I was happy for such a while. For such a while. I had never been happier. And I thought, well, that was it. It was difficult. But they were just checking up on me. I almost, for a while, felt grateful. And then I remembered what Miles had been accused of. And I looked at my Flora, and there seemed something forced, something almost too grown up in the way she worried about me. And I couldn't quite forget it. And then after weeks, I had sent them to bed. Mrs. Gorse had gone to bed. It was late. 11 o'clock. I had stayed reading. I had a candle. Downstairs in the library. Just making sure that I was up to the job of being a good teacher. And when I went up the stairs, the light was bad. I had to take my candle and light an oil lamp. And that gave it a bit better. My room was 2 flights up. And I was just going up that first flight of stairs when suddenly I saw a shadow on the staircase. Staring at me was the same gaunt figure. Staring at me. trying to stare me down, and I felt the black eyes that I had seen from the tower beat upon me. Well, I am quite defiant. I turned up the oil lamp bright. I held it up and I stared back at him and carried on going up the stairs. And the dark form seemed to flee, although I could not see him moving. Always the same distance in front of me, staring. I shivered. It took all my courage. My heart beat and beat and beat. But up the stairs I went, staring all the way. I felt that if I backed down now, that would be it. So I did not back down. I came to the top of the stairs, and he was gone. Just dark. A kind of listening dark. Just then I heard a movement in Flora's room. I ran in, and she wasn't in her bed. There was a blowing in from the curtains. And I went through the curtains, and on her little balcony, there she was, in her pretty little nightgown, looking out into the dark. I said, "Child, what are you doing?" And she looked at me strangely and just said, "Talking, talking." "Who to?" And then for a moment she listened and shook her head. And without further word, went to bed. Well, from that time on, my uncle, I felt the house was not my own. That always in the dark and in the shadows, I felt those two were watching my children. That their influence was not that benign feeling I had felt, but something utterly debased. And I hate to use the words of ghosts, but modern. They were watching my children and would corrupt them if they could. Oh, uncle, it was terrible to think of. And all the harder, for I had to keep the knowledge of what I now knew from my children. I had a word with Mrs. Gorse, and she said, "No, shall we write to the master about this? He ought to come home if that's really what you think." But I didn't trust myself. I didn't. I really didn't. So I said, no, we would manage it as best we can. I remember I didn't sleep very well all week. And one of those times I did fitfully fall asleep. When I woke up, dreaming, slowly, I felt there was a presence in the room. I woke up, stretching, and looked. And there, standing on the edge of my bed, the head of my bed, looking down on me, she was. The figure I knew as the old governess, Miss Jessup, with her skin marked, her eyes red. Red, I tell you, as if she had been crying. Crying her heart out, crying as if her soul would break. And I looked at her and I shivered, and I thought I heard something from the room next door. That was Flora's room. I ran in, and once again she was gone. I went to the balcony, and she was staring out into the dark. And halfway across the lawn and heading further out, there was young Miles, dressed as if he was running away. And I called to him and said, "Miles, what are you doing?" And he stopped as if he woke up. "Come back here at once!" I cried to him. And as I cried loud, all the dogs barked. And almost shamefacedly, he turned and came back, and I said, I'm not going to say anything to you tonight. Go to bed. And the next morning I summoned him before me, and he stared at me and said, I just wanted to prove to you that I could be bad as well. And that made me shiver. For I thought of his school report. Could this child, so lovely, so beautiful, really be that bad in the end? Of course not. Well, the next day was church, and I insisted that we would all go, as if everything was normal, which it was really. I kept on telling myself, which it was really. But in the carriage, Miles turned to me and said, I want to go back to my school, please. Because if I don't go back to my school, my uncle will come here, and if my uncle comes here, or... Your uncle? Sorry, my father. My father will come, and if my father will come, I call him uncle for I very seldom see him. If my father comes, he will stop all our games. Can I go back to school? I must do. Don't you see? I must do. That we're all safe. And he looked at me so urgently, and there was something in his pleading that felt not quite right. I shivered. I realised I could not go to church. Not with my head a tumult like this. I would only scream in the catechism or declare something. So I walked home and sent the children in. And I came back to the house. I remembered I'd seen Mrs. Jessup there. I went into the schoolroom, and there she was, the strange woman, weeping. I screamed! And the next thing I knew, Mrs. Gorse was standing over me, and I was being revived with smelling salts. She took me to a parlour, and when I'd finished my story, she said, now we really must write to the master. So, although my heart would break, I wrote to the master asking him to come. And that night I sat with Miles thinking, I've betrayed you. I remember there was a moment we sat by candlelight, for we hadn't lit the gas, at his request. And near his bedtime there was a sudden gust of wind, and the candles went out. And I reached to him and I hugged him, and I felt his heart tight within me, as if he was scared. But he said nothing, only, you're holding quite tight, you know. Just then, Miss Gorse came in and lit the gas. And I sent Miles to bed, and I turned to Miss Gorse and said, I think it will be a relief when the master comes. And Mrs. Gorse said, I'm sure it will. That was near the end. So near. It was the next day, or perhaps, Uncle, it was the day after. Miles asked me, can you play the piano, please? I have heard that you play beautifully. And I sat down, and I played. And he sat there on my left, and Mrs. Gorse sat upon my right. And I felt so happy. I played all the sonatas he asked for, even the difficult ones. And then I looked round. It was late afternoon, after tea time, and I was thinking it would soon be Flora's bedtime. But she wasn't there. Suddenly, I stopped. She wasn't there. I called to Mrs. Gorse, and we ran out. And following some inclination, I ran to the lake. And there she was, and by her a black figure, all dark, white skin pock-marked, staring eyes, who seemed to be talking to her. And I screamed to Flora, come here, child! And reluctantly she seemed to come. And I looked up, and the apparition was gone. And I said to Flora, "You must never talk to what I know you saw. Never, I tell you." And she looked at me and cried and screamed and said that I was the unkindest woman she'd ever known, and that she'd always hated me, and she could not bear to be here any longer. Well, Mrs. Gorse took her up in her arms, the poor little chit, and comforted her, and agreed with her and then with me that Flora would go to see her father in London. No, and I would write to that effect. But I said, "But isn't he coming here?" And Mrs. Gorse said, "Well, we agreed that he were, but you didn't write the letter. It wasn't found this morning." And I wondered at it. What had happened to my letter? Well, the next day I felt my heart would break as Flora and Mrs. Gorse started the journey back. That evening I sat with Miles. He seemed reflective and said, "I know what the headmaster wrote to you, and I'm sorry for it. I know about your letter asking Father to come here, for I destroyed it." And I said, "But why? How could you be so unkind, child?" And he looked at me and said, "Because I was told to do it." "By whom?" And he suddenly looked up. And I saw, and I turned, and standing behind us was the same dark-eyed man, hair long, and I could see it was pulled over his forehead, but behind I had a hint of bone. For a moment he turned his back on us, and then he turned back, and his eyes looked challenging, and I whispered to Miles, "Do you see him too?" And Miles whispered, "No!" And I said, "You do, don't you? All you have to do is admit it, and then I will hold you close to me. And together we will fight that evil spirit that was once Mr. Quint." And Miles said, "You're holding tight. Yes, 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 I see him!" And I felt jubilation as I held Miles tight to me, feeling I would never let him go, feeling his heart close to mine, not looking behind at Mr. Quint, feeling his heart beat again and again. And then suddenly, as I held him tight to me, his little heart seemed to stop. His face pallid. And that is all, Uncle. That is all. And so it ended. But what was exactly my niece? And who was her patron, the handsome stranger with the lone children? I'm afraid I shall leave quite